This is the beginning of podcast number 12 on Chapter 9, Maintaining Appropriate Behavior. There are several key concepts to this chapter. About maintaining the established learning environment is something that must be consciously cultivated. Appropriate behavior is not the mere absence of inappropriate behavior. That's important to remember. You have to design your class and the gymnasium so that it has the least disruptions and the least chances for students to get off task or be inattentive. If a learning environment is not effective, before blaming the students, you need to assess your own teaching behaviors to see if your actions have contributed to the non-functioning environment. Always look in the mirror first before you start thinking that it's the students, because many times it's what you have done as a teacher that has contributed to the disruptive behavior, or at least you have not prevented disruptive behavior from occurring. There are three aspects of maintaining a learning environment. One is to increase the appropriate behavior. The second thing is try to decrease the inappropriate behavior, and dealing with whole class problems. What do you do when the whole class seems to be off task, and how you need to stop that class and redirect their focus. There are both proactive and reactive strategies that can be used to increase appropriate behavior. Some proactive strategies include positive interaction with the children, prompting correct responses, and eliminating differential treatment of students. Sometimes teachers have what we call unwritten expectations of students by just the way they look or act. And sometimes those expectations can be high. In other words, they see athletes as being possibly more talented than other people, or those expectations may be low. If they see that there are obese or overweight students in their classes, they think that they can't be fit and they can't move, and that's just not true. Behavior problems can be classified as a non-problem, a minor problem, a major problem, or an escalating problem, which means it's getting worse and worse. Ignoring inappropriate behavior when it is inconsequential or a non-problem, keen use of nonverbal interactions, and person-to-person dialogue are strategies that allow teachers to appropriately react to student behavior. To decrease inappropriate behavior, teachers can use what we call desist, which means you ask them to stop, positive practice, timeouts, planning time, behavior contracts, letters to parents, and as a last resort, you can involve the principal. Usually principals don't want to be involved with behavior problems unless you have exhausted every possibility that you have. And of course, whole class behavior can be maintained by developing personal and social responsibility, giving class rewards, and of course token systems for this slide helps us to talk about defining appropriate behavior. Appropriate behavior is student behavior that is consistent with the educational goals of a specific educational setting. In other words, a specific setting. Every class and gym and teacher and student is different, so the appropriateness of behavior is determined by the specific setting. It could be that in one setting something is appropriate, but in another setting it would be inappropriate. So that's an important thing to remember. It's specific to the setting or the learning environment that you're in. Appropriate behavior is not the mere absence of inappropriate behavior. It means that appropriate behavior is responsible behavior exhibited by the students. As mentioned before, there are four categories of disruptive behavior: non-problem, minor problem, major problem but limited in scope and effects, and escalating or spreading problem. This next slide shows you some examples at each of those four levels of management issues. You need to study these levels of management, and you need to look at what is listed under each level. Non-problem examples are things about brief periods of inattention, short pauses while working, standing at the back of the group while others are sitting, a little talking while others are talking, occasionally not immediately stopping on the signal, and so on. That's not really a problem unless it gets to be consistent and it gets to be longer after a while. And that then it becomes a minor problem. Minor problem would be excessive talking during group work, running to get equipment after being asked to walk, excessive playing with equipment when it should be held, inappropriate language, interrupting the teacher in particular when you're trying to talk, and lying, of course. They list it as a minor problem, but that's something that you'd have to address as responsibility. Major problem is examples are constant movement around the space, refusal to participate, violation of school rules, fighting, of course, that's not a good thing, and unsafe actions while they're practicing. A major escalating problem would be roaming around at will, leaving the space, going outside the boundaries, going outside or going into the bathroom without permission, those kinds of things, constant interference with others, and blatant refusal to cooperate. As we mentioned before, there are 3 different strategies for dealing with student behavior issues. We want to increase the appropriate behavior of the students, decrease the inappropriate behavior, and deal with whole class problems in a rational and organized way. Some proactive strategies that increase the likelihood that appropriate behavior will continue are positive interactions, both verbal and nonverbal. Nonverbal could be things like winking, a fist bump, a high five, a teacher look or a stare, a thumbs up, those kinds of things. Eliminating differential treatment by teachers, not singling out children with a reprimand each time they display inappropriate behavior, and something called prompting or reminding students what is expected of them. Some techniques for increasing appropriate behaviors might be called reactive strategies that are used after the inappropriate behavior has occurred, might be ignoring the inappropriate behavior if it's for a short duration, a minor deviation, or reacting would cause an interruption. Nonverbal teacher interactions, simple nonverbal techniques such as close physical proximity or going to stand next to the student who might be misbehaving, borrowing equipment, eye contact, simple signal, those kinds of things. And the last thing is person-to-person dialogue, talking with the student outside of the physical education class. In other words, you have to be able to reason with children as much as you can, but it is hard to do for pre-kindergarten students that are very young. Some techniques for decreasing inappropriate behaviors are positive practice. It means requiring the student to practice the desired behavior. Desist, verbally telling a child to stop doing something. Timeouts, which means you withdraw them from class for an amount of time, and for younger kids it should be a shorter amount of time. Planning time, resolving conflicts with another person. Behavior contracts, which is a formal agreement between the teacher and student. Letters to parents that list specific violations, and that would include calls to parents also, and involving the principal as a last resort. Some ideas about maintaining appropriate behavior of the whole class are reward systems, class rewards as a whole, like giving them free play at the last day of the week if they behave correctly the whole week. Token systems, which reward desirable behavior by giving tokens that can be exchanged for various awards. That's very helpful, particularly in secondary level. And of course, you want them to try to develop personal and social responsibility. This slide shows a list of teaching skills that you can develop that promote a positive learning environment. Keep the movement patterns unpredictable, in other words, your movement patterns throughout the class. Scan the class frequently. Be seen and heard by all children. Provide clear, concise directions. Separate organization aspects of directions from the content, and have the eyes in the back of your head. We do call that with itness. And that means that you're using your peripheral vision to be able to see and hear what's going on around you all the time. And on the last slide, we have some teaching skills that promote a positive learning environment. You need to practice overlapping or multitasking during a class. Avoid dangles or unfinished statements, and particularly when you're giving directions, you don't want to stop giving the directions and then the students don't know what to do after they get to a certain point. Avoid flip-flopping, terminating one activity, starting another, and returning to the first. In other words, changing your mind a lot about what needs to be done in the class. Using targeting or directing your interactions toward the appropriate students. And display the skill of timing. In other words, timing and being able to stop and start things and get the student's attention by silence sometimes, or staring, or close proximity, or whatever. One more thing on this podcast I'd like to mention is that there is a handout on Blackboard about the class management plan and how to develop that as a teacher. It says to list levels of consequences, rules and protocols, intervention strategies, start and stop signals, and so on. And the class management plan that you have is your behavior system. If you observe any physical education teacher, you'll see that they have a certain system of doing things. They have different start and stop signals from each other, usually, but it's whatever works for them is the best way to do it. And you can take any of those things and any of those examples from the role models of mentor teachers that you'll have. Then the last thing is we do have 8 class management scenarios that are a handout on Blackboard that you can read and see how you would solve those class management scenarios by using teaching skills like we've talked about today. This is the end of podcast number 13 on Chapter 9.